there was a meeting at Sandringham. He says he doesn't remember who called it the Sandringham Summit. Probably the press. He says that on his way there, Marco, remember Marco from the early days, had texted him about a story in the Times. And here Willie was declaring that he and I were now separate entities. According to this article, William had said, quote, "I've put my arm around my brother all our lives, and I can't do that anymore." I think it's interesting that he says Marco said it to him, as if what he's saying is Marco was siding with me. He was letting me know how William had betrayed me. But, you know, this is so classic Harry, because Marco was William's before he was ever Harry's. And he was William's personal secretary. Now, Harry had clung on to Marco, thinking Marco was like the bomb.com, but I just don't think that that's the way that text went down. What I think is, I think Marco said, "What has become of the two of you? What is happening with you both?" Not like, "Can you believe what your brother's saying about you?" But that's how Harry would have us believe it, by just dropping in, "Then Marco sent me this text." You know? It's just so typical of this entire book. It's so one-sided. Okay, so he says that the real problem here about the summit was that Meg had gone back to Canada to be with Archie. So he was on his own. He was on his own for the summit. He said that he had gone over. He immediately spotted Granny by the fireplace, so he scuttled over to take a seat next to her. She was sitting on a bench, and he sat down beside her. But of course, the wasp came buzzing over, and moments later returned with Pa, who sat beside Harry. And then shortly after that, Willie comes scuttling over. He says that Willie looked like he wanted to murder me. What? "Hello, Harold." He sat across from me. Separate entities, indeed. He writes that when all the participants had arrived, they shifted to the long conference table, and Granny was at the head, and they commenced. Well, he then gives his summary of why he felt that this was his only recourse, to say that they were going to move to Canada. By the way, they had not hammered out the details for what his life would now look like. So he's preemptively said, you know, we're going to go live this lifestyle. But that hasn't been sanctioned by anyone yet. They just felt like they were in competition with the showbiz guy who wrote an article about them. So then they felt like they had to hustle up and say something about it. But it was so premature because nothing had actually officially been decided yet. So this is the meeting where they're going to decide, okay, officially, what are we sanctioning you to do? So if it all looked like a mess, it's because it was a mess. All right, so he says, and this is his definition of how his life has gone. "I referenced their cruel and criminal behavior, the press, you know, but said that they had a ton of help. This family had enabled the papers by looking the other way or by actively courting them, and some of our staff had worked directly with the press, briefing them, planting stories, occasionally rewarding and fetting them. The press was a big part of why we'd come to this crisis. Their business model demanded that we be in constant conflict. But they weren't the only culprits, and I wanted everyone at the table to know that." He said he looked at Willie, expecting that Willie would jump in and be like, "Yeah, Paul and Camilla, you guys are part of the problem." But of course, William didn't do that. Instead, he said, you know, "I'm really upset about a story that's come out today that paints me as the bully who's bullying you out of the family. We know that's not true. And I really resent the fact that there's a story out there right now saying that I have cast you out into the abyss by bullying you, pushing you out, and trying to, you know, lord over you. You know that's not what's happening." So Harry felt that what William was implying was, you say we're leaking things, but it seems to me like maybe you're planting some stories. Well, Harry quickly comes to his own defense on that, and he says, and listen to this, this is such a weak excuse. "We had nothing to do with that story. But imagine how you'd feel if we had leaked it. And then you know how Meg and I have felt all these last 3 years." Okay, you say you didn't leak it, but that's exactly what everybody else is saying, yet you refuse to believe that. So it's not okay for you to say, you know, I don't believe you aren't leaking, but, you know, I'm not leaking. You are, but I'm not. Okay, but by what measure am I supposed to believe that?
You have no evidence that anybody at this table has leaked anything. You think you do because things from that one memo were leaked, but that wasn't Pa. That could have been any number of people in that office who could have just taken a picture of it with their phone. Anybody could have seen that. Like, that is like the sorriest defense. I ain't have anything to do with that. But what if I, think how bad you feel if I did? That's not an excuse. Okay, so Granny's like, let's move on. Let's start talking about some options. So there was 5 options that had been laid on the table. The first was, we're just going to go with the status quo. Nothing changes. You guys are going to continue to proceed as usual. Meg and Harry won't leave. Everyone tries to go back to normal. All the way down to option 5, which was full severance, no royal roll, no working for Granny, a total loss of security. Well, as you can imagine, Harry didn't want either of those. He was more interested in kind of option 3. Option 3 was somewhere in between. It was a compromise. It was the closest to what he had initially said he wanted. And Harry told everybody assembled that he was desperate to keep security. That was all he wanted because, as it stood, he, his wife, and his son had giant targets on their back. And there was absolutely no way they would survive without security. They'd be gunned down in the streets within minutes. So all he cared about was his family's physical safety. And he wanted to prevent a repeat of history. Harry, your mother was killed by a drunk driver. She was not wearing a seatbelt. She was not killed by the paparazzi. How many times are you going to lie to yourself about the scenario surrounding your mother's death so that you can keep prattling on and making your life more interesting? The paparazzi around everywhere. They're not, though. They are not. I would just love to see even just half of the stories he claims were written. I would love to just see half of the pictures he claims were taken. I would love to see one smidgen of evidence to prove that they were hounded beyond anything reasonable in this world. No, there's no proof of it. Okay, so he says he's got to have security. If he doesn't get one other thing, he's got to have security. And so, he consulted palace veterans, and they all said that option 3 was a completely legitimate option. It was totally doable, and there was no reason why Harry should suspect anything else of happening. Nobody was so unreasonable as not to give them option 3. Well, but the family, of course, pushed me to take option 1. Barring that, they would only accept option 5. Can you believe the monstrous, outrageous, outlandish hatred in their hearts for me, my wife, and my baby? So he said they discussed option 5 for nearly an hour. Finally, the bee got up and passed out some statements, some pre-composed statements that they would release to the press saying that they had come up with option 5. Wait, well, I'm confused. You've already drafted a statement before any discussion announcing option 5. Well, in other words, the fix was in this whole time. This summit was just for show. No answer. I asked if there were other drafts of other statements announcing the other options. Well, yes, of course, said the bee. Well, I want to see him then. And the bee said that unfortunately wasn't possible because just as he was about to print this one out, the printer jammed. So he'd only been able to get out option 5, but, in his computer, there were the other drafts. Well, Harry didn't buy that. And he stands up, as you can imagine, he's sweat right through his suit. Is this some kind of a joke? I've got to get out here and get some air. Granny, can I go get some air? Granny said he could. So he staggers out of the room, goes out and walks the long hall. Who should he run into but Mr. R, the former upstairs neighbor of the Badger set. They could see he was upset and said, is there anything that they can do to help? Mr. R was with Lady Susan, one of Granny's ladies in waiting. Anyway, they all said, is there anything we can do? Because Harry's just, absolutely foaming at the mouth. No, there's nothing anyone can do for him. He goes back into the room and he said that there was some more discussion about the coveted option 3. Or was it option 2? Nobody seemed to be able to figure it out. Harry said that he had a headache and they were starting to wear him down. He was just so vulnerable, without Meg right there.
He says, I didn't bloody care which option we adopted, so long as security remained in place. I pleaded for continuation of the same armed police protection that I'd had since birth. And since I had needed since birth, let me remind you. I'd never been allowed to go anywhere without 3 armed bodyguards, even when I was supposedly the most popular member of the family. And now I was the target, along with my wife and son, of unprecedented hate. And the leading proposal under discussion called for total abandonment? My lord, what in the world? It was all madness.
And then he says that, listen to how bad it had gotten. He offered to defray the cost of security out of his own pocket. I wasn't sure how I'd do that, but I'd find a way. I don't know, out of the coffers of your millions, how about tap into that, reserve that your mother had set aside for you? How about that? He said that he made one last pitch.
Look, please, have mercy. Meg and I don't care about perks. We care about working, serving, and staying alive.
It's so dramatic. Working, serving. Okay, sir, would you mind describing vaguely? You don't have to get into detail. Just tell me bullet points. What work have you been doing? What charities have you been associated with? What work can we expect you to continue doing when no work has been done for about 3 years? I mean, just like, who does he think he is? What life does he think we've all been watching him live? That we would be, that we could begin to believe that all you care about is working, serving,
and staying alive.
He says that the meeting closed, and there was a basic general agreement that they would sort it out, over a 12-month transitional period. They all rose. Granny walked out. But Harry had unfinished business. He says that he had to find out about that printer. If they thought they were going to scam and scheme him, no, sir. So he says that he was going to find the Bee's office and find out about that malfunctioning printer. Just as he was looking and sniffing around for the office, who should he run into but one of the Queen's friendliest pages, who'd always liked him. He asked for directions, and the page said, I'll take you right there. So he brings him through the kitchen, up some back stairs, down a narrow alley. It's just down that way, says the page. A few steps later, he comes to a huge printer that's just dashing out documents. And the Bee's assistant, swings around and says, hello. I pointed at the printer and said,
this seems to be working fine.
Yes, Your Royal Highness.
It's not broken.
That thing? It's indestructible, sir. I asked about the printer in the Bee's office.
That one worked too.
Oh, yes, sir. Did you need to print something out?
No, thank you.
He says he went down a familiar corridor. Look, it's the same place I had to stay in at that Christmas after the South Pole incident. And just as he should be walking around the corner, who should he run right into? Smack right into with the Bee. The Bee saw me, looked extremely sheepish, Harry's favorite word. He could tell what I was up to. He heard the printer whirring away, and he knew he was busted. Oh, sir, please, sir, don't worry about that. It's really not important.
Isn't it?
So he goes downstairs. He's all mad. He's all upset. Someone suggests that he and Willie take just step outside, cool your heads. So they go. Both of them are freezing cold. They didn't have really any kind of coats on. He had a light jacket. Poor Willie's got nothing but a sweater on. And as he's walking the grounds, he's thinking about how beautiful it all is. In the same way he had thought about the stateroom when he'd been in there. It was just so beautiful, so palatial. How had he never noticed this before? He says, these gardens, I thought they're paradise. Why can't we just enjoy them? But have you tried just enjoying them? No, because that's not exciting. Where's the adrenaline rush in enjoying a beautiful garden? Anyway, he'd braced himself for a lecture, but lo and behold, Willie didn't didn't come and attack him. There he thought that Willie was going to rush at him, biting him in the jugular, but as it turned out, Willie was subdued. He says that Willie wanted to listen, and for the first time in a long time, his brother heard him out, and he was so grateful. And then it's like, how can you begin to tell me that William's the bad guy? At the end of every story, William turns out to be the great guy. He writes that,
I told him about one past staff member sabotaging Meg, plotting against her. And I told him about how one current staff member, whose close friend was taking payments for leaking private stuff to the press about Meg and me. My sources on this were above reproach, including several journalists and barristers. Plus, I'd made a visit to New Scotland Yard. Willie frowned. He and Kate had their own suspicions. He'd look into it, and we agreed to keep talking.
Yeah, Willie sounds like a real bastard. Okay, so then he talks about how just on the heels of this healing moment with William, what should come out but a statement with his name on it that he had not agreed to. And here's the statement. He says that a strongly worded denial had been put out by the palace, squashing the morning's bullying story, the one that William had been concerned about, saying, I'm not pushing you out and I don't know where this story is coming from. He says that the denial was signed by none other than me and Willie. My name attached by faceless others to words I'd never seen, let alone approved?
I was stunned.
But exactly why? Because when you were in that meeting, you told William, I didn't leak that. I don't know anything about that. I know that it's hurtful for you that the press is writing stories that don't make sense, but exactly, that's my whole point. So he hadn't seen the statement, but his sentiment in the meeting was, I don't support that story in the news. I didn't write that. I didn't leak that. That's not my feeling. So he hadn't written in writing that he didn't like the story, but he verbalized it to everybody there. So I would assume that the palace, in a desire to get ahead of that negative story, because people love nothing more than a dispute between brothers, and in a desire to get ahead of that, they just said, okay, we've heard him say he didn't do it. We've heard him say he doesn't agree with it. We'll just go ahead and put his name on this because we know that's how he feels. He said so. So why is Harry now so outraged about a statement that presumably he agreed with? This is so much like the leaked letter to Daddy that Meg wrote, and then being scandalized that it had been leaked to the press, but she stood behind every word of it. So what do you care if somebody else reads it? It's a private letter, but who cares? In the same way, you stated to William, I don't know where that story came from, and I don't agree with it. Okay, so now let's let the comms people go out and say something, and you're scandalized by this? It's like, you've never seen somebody more eager to be outraged. So he, stumbles back to Frogmore, and he says that about this time, around January 18th, 2020, the palace had announced that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex had agreed to step back and would no longer be formally representative of the Queen, and their royal titles would be in abeyance during the transitional year. They'd also offered to reimburse the sovereign grant for refurbishments to Frogmore Cottage, since they would no longer be staying there. And there was a firm no comment on the status of their security. So the one thing that Harry wanted to know about, people were holding out on him in typical fashion. He says that he got back to Vancouver. He had a delicious reunion with Meg, Archie, and the dogs. But for a few days, he just couldn't fully be back and be present. He says part of him was still in Britain, still at Sandringham.
I spent hours glued to my phone and the internet, monitoring the fallout. The ire directed at us by the papers and the trolls was alarming. So you finally get to go be with your kid, and all you can do is look at your phone? Sounds like great parenting.
The Daily Mail said that, make no mistake, it was an absolute slap across the face of the Queen. He might as well have just gone and spit in her eye. And, on and on and on and on. He says that he shook his head. There was just no mercy. It was all the language of war. His favorite thing. But what shocked me was this passage here. He says, clearly this was more than simple anger. These men and women saw me as an existential threat. If our leaving posed a threat to the monarchy, as some were saying, then it posed a threat to all those covering the monarchy for a living. Doesn't he understand that there's more to the monarchy than people just having a chance to write about it? Like, how little does he understand the role of his own family in government? If he thinks that the whole reason that the press is upset at the threat he has posed is because now they won't have something to write about? What a slap in the face of all the things that his grandmother has accomplished over all her years, all the charities that the family has funded, all the spotlights that the various members have placed on things that matter, all the work that his own mother had done for AIDS and for landmines and for all these other charities that she had, with her winning presence, managed to create so much attention for in a positive way. And then for him to say, they just don't want the monarchy to go away because then they won't have anything to write about. Really? You really shouldn't have been a prince. Okay, so people are saying that Harry didn't tell his grandmother that he was going to leave. He just suddenly got into a plane and never came back. Who would even believe that? You know, so again, yeah, these, you know, if people are saying wild things about you, wild and unbelievable things, you don't need to carry that on your back. Who cares what they say? No one believes that. He says, I sat up late, brooding on all of it, going over the progression of events and asking myself, what's the matter with these people? What makes them like this? Just go live your life. You finally have what you said you wanted. But of course he can't, because he's just wringing his hands about the state of his security. He says that one of the things that people were most mad about was the amount of money that Harry and Meghan had spent on their lifestyle as royals. So we know that Meghan's clothing budget was through the roof, and she didn't honestly do that many engagements, but somehow she spent the most on clothes. You know, one of the things I love so much about Catherine, amongst the many things I love so much about her, is the fact that you often see her wearing things that she's had remade so that they look new and fresh, but they're dresses that she's had redone so that she's not being wasteful with the beautiful clothes that she has. We'll see her wearing a dress, you know, and maybe the sleeves are different, or there's a different sash on it, or, you know, whatever. But she does that frequently. She's not a waster of money. And anyway, so he says that also people were horrified by how much had been spent at the wedding. And he wants you to know that half of that was for the security that of course they had to have, because he and Meghan were just such an inflammatory couple that were it not for the security that had been provided at the wedding, how would they even be alive today? That was the true question. So he says that security experts themselves had told him that the snipers and sniffer dogs weren't just there necessarily for Harry and Meghan, although they definitely had needed them, but they were really there for everybody else, so that, you know, some wild person wouldn't come start shooting into the crowd, or a suicide bomber blowing things up at the parade route. Yeah, they're also there for the Queen and all the dignitaries that happen to be there. It's like, he doesn't need to explain to me why they had security there. No one thought all the security was there for him and Meghan. That was like a delusion that he has been on and on about. Like, I looked up and there was the snipers. And now he's trying to come around and be like, actually, they weren't really for us. You just already told me earlier in the book that they were there for you. Did you not know why they were there? Anyway, then he wants to go on and on and on about how people were upset about the way what their taxes were being used for, and he goes on, he tries to be, you know, history buff there and talk about the history of the crown and the tax money. I don't really want to hear it from him. I don't think he knows much about the subject. But then he says that he wasn't trying to undermine the authority of the monarchy with his decision. It had nothing to do with that. And he writes this: my problem had never been with the monarchy, nor the concept of monarchy. It's been with the press and the sick relationship that's involved between it and the palace. I love my mother country. I love my family.
And I always will. I just wish at the second darkest moment of my life they'd both been there for me. And I believe they'll look back one day and wish they had too.
Please. You're going to try to tell me that the country was not behind you when your mother died? What is he talking about? At the second darkest moment of my life, I just wish that the country and my family had been there for me? Your family was there for you. Your country was there for you when your mother died. There was such an outpouring of love for you and your brother. Horrified that this had been something that you had had to deal with. All right, so then he moves on. He says, now, okay, they've gotten their freedom, but where are they going to live? They'd considered Canada. By and large, it had been good for them. But the thing was, they ultimately had to find a place that the press didn't know about. In Canada? I think you can find any number of places in Canada where you're going to have some peace and quiet. I'm pretty sure that the majority of Canada is full of peace and quiet. Anyway, he says that Meg got in touch with a Vancouver friend who connected us to an estate agent, and they started looking at houses. I don't know if they were looking at houses, mansions, but they were taking some steps. They're trying to be positive. I mean, it was hard, what with so much pressure on them. All they could really think about was their security. He says that one night Meg had asked him, "You don't think that they'll ever pull our security, do you?" "And never, not in this climate of hate, not after what happened to my mother." And what was that again? What happened to her? Can you explain? Then he's got to throw Andrew under the bus. Now look, I don't think any of us are defending Andrew, but there wasn't any reason for him to drag Andrew into it. He says, "Also, not in the wake of my Uncle Andrew. He was embroiled in a shameful scandal, accused of the sexual assault of a young woman. And no one had so much as suggested that he'd lose his security. Or whatever grievances people had against us, sex crimes weren't on the list." Andrew would truly need some kind of protection. He's done things that have outraged people and made people very angry. And people have enough questions about the way he has behaved that there might be somebody out there mad enough to decide, vengeance is mine, try to go get him. But Harry, exactly, you haven't committed any crimes that would mean that your life is in danger by people who want to play the vigilante. So it would make more sense for Andrew to get security and for them not to give it to you. You don't need it. Okay. So then he tells us this sad and, devastating tale of woe. February 2020. I'd scooped Archie from his nap, took him out to the lawn. It was sunny and it was cold. We gazed out at the water and touched the dry leaves and collected rocks and twigs. I kissed his chubby little cheeks, tickled him. Then, because I couldn't help it, grabbed my phone. I glanced down at my phone to see a text from the head of our security team, Lloyd. He needed to see me. I carried Archie across the garden and handed him to Meg. Then went across to the soggy grass at the cottage where Lloyd and the other bodyguards were staying. We sat on a bench, both of us wearing puffer jackets, waves rolling gently in the background. Lloyd told me that our security was being pulled, and the whole team had been ordered to evacuate.
"Surely they can't."
I tend to agree, but they are. So he says, so much for the years of transition. They were supposed to have a whole year, but now Lloyd's saying that they got to go home.
"So here we are," I said, "the ultimate nightmare, the sort of worst case scenario. Any bad actor in the world would now be able to find us, and it would just be me with a pistol to stop them. And no, not even that, because we're in Canada, so I can't have a pistol."
He rang Pa, who wouldn't take his calls. And then he got a text from Willie, and Willie said, "Can you speak? I want to talk to you." Great. I was sure my older brother, after our recent walk in Sandringham Gardens, would be sympathetic. He'd step up. But no, he said it was a government decision. Nothing to be done. Well, that's because it's tax-funded security and you're not in the country anymore. So why should the British people fund something that they get no benefit from?